Well, I've got about 3 after, so it's about time for us to get started. We're going to be looking at finishing up the discussion on depression, and from there, I don't know what we're going to do next, honestly, but we'll have something next week. And next week isn't singing week, is it? No, this is the first Wednesday, so. Let's go ahead and begin with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're humbled to come before you as your children. We thank you that you've given us the opportunity to be your children. Pray, Father, that we'll glorify you, that we'll never take it for granted, the blessings and the joys that it is being able to serve you with our lives, to bring you honor and glory. Please help us as we go through class, that we can understand you better, we can understand ourselves, that we can, Lord, help those people who are suffering and going through difficulties related to this and other things, that we can be an encouragement to them, that pray that you will strengthen them. Help us all, Father, to be the people that you want us to be, to grow and mature and overcome the challenges and the situations. And if we're not able to overcome, Father, help us to continue to grow and to develop and to put our faith and trust in you for the outcome. Thank you so much for the congregation here. Pray, Father, that you'll help us to grow, help us to find people in the community who are looking for you, that we can be able to have the opportunity to sit and talk to them and show them from your word what you would have them to do and to become. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Okay, so we were on the in the discussion about treatments, I think. No, not treatments. Yeah. These are general ideas of things that we can do that help. And I want to say again, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not trying to pretend to be one. These are from observations, personal experiences, also some things that I've seen in counseling other people, and even some general ideas from Scripture. Some of these are too. So we have to be careful. Anytime we're talking about things like this, I think we have to be very careful, because even the psychologists who think they know everything don't know everything. There's a lot of things that we don't know about the mind and the psyche. And so we have to trust that God knows what he's doing and that he's created ways and avenues for us to get better and for us to improve ourselves, or at the very least to learn how to manage what we have. And so that's kind of the attitude I've been trying to have as going through this, and hopefully it can be an encouragement. The last one we ended with was being open to our brothers and sisters if we're having problems. And that is, we're talking to them, let them know these are some of the things I'm going through. They may not understand, and they very well may. So we can't make assumptions, right? We don't know what they know or what they don't know, or what they may be going through similar things. And it's very easy for us to assume, anytime we have something bad happen to us or we're going through something difficult, we assume that no one else understands. We're very alone, we're isolated. And that's a very dangerous place to be, to think that no one gets us, that we're not like other people. And so we have to reach out even more. The more of a temptation you have to pull back, the more you should push yourself to make the effort. And it won't always be accepted, but you will find the opportunity. There will be people I've found that the brotherhood is very generous, and when I've trusted to open up to people and talk to them about difficulties, most of the time I've had great results from that. There's always going to be those exceptions, right? Let's not let the exceptions cause us to behave differently than we should, and that's certainly. So we need to be open to each other. We read a couple passages from Job where he was actually chiding and chastising his friends because they weren't helping him, but he was actually giving some insight. And there's 2 or 3 other places, I didn't look them up, but I can remember 2 or 3 other opportunities that he took to explain to his friends, listen, if you're going to help me, here's what you ought to do. And so that would be good to go through. We already went through that book, I think it felt like a year to get through it, but there is a lot of insight in there from his perspective and his suffering that is good for us to go through and read. So the next one I would say, this is number 6 of the 8 things that I have, is to be honest with yourself. And I mentioned the first one of this series of this list was to accept reality, and that's certainly what we should do. But that includes we have to be honest with ourselves. And there are 2 dangers that relate to this that we can kind of go to extremes, I guess. You may ignore things until they're too strong. You've overcome. They've overcome you. It's like a big, huge tidal wave, and now you don't know what you're going to do, and you're in panic mode because you may not see it coming, or it may be coming along, and you may be having lots of difficulties and problems, but you just refuse to accept it. And if this happens sometimes with people who have been getting treatments for a while, or they've been having counseling, or they've been doing their own thing, and they're starting to feel better. What happens typically when people, let's say they're in a psych ward or whatever, and they're getting lots of medication, and they start to feel better, what's the tendency that they have? They stop taking the medicine because I feel better, right? And so that's a definite danger, and that's kind of an extreme of what I'm saying here. But if we ignore things too long, it can really affect us. We might get into thinking, I can handle it. It's no big deal, right? I don't need any help, or I don't need to reach out, or I don't need to do any of the things. I can just kind of coast. And let's face it, if you're facing challenges like this, you don't want to do anything, and that's part of the problem. And so it's easier to just slack off a little bit and let things happen, or let things go a little bit. Because most of us are not able to keep routines very strict for a very long period of time, or a lot of people aren't, right? Y'all all may be that way. I'm not that way. It's very difficult for me to stay with routines for a long period of time. It can be very difficult. But we have to stay with it as best we can. The other make it a whole lot bigger of a problem than it actually is, and that's definitely a tendency that we see, that I can see that people do sometimes. I've done it myself. Overthinking. Have you ever done that before? Where you're just thinking about it too much. You got to get out of your own head a little bit, because if you think about a problem, I learned, I don't know, I'm sure everyone can understand this. I learned at a young age that if I thought about a certain part of my body, say my arm, enough, and I thought about it hurting, I could make it hurt. That eventually it would start to hurt, and I could feel pain. All right, so I'm not suggesting that pain is all in our heads. That's not what I mean at all. But I do know that if all we do is focus on it, then it's going to multiply. And so we have to be careful. That's something we should avoid as much as possible. Not admitting that it's there, and also overthinking it and making it worse. And so you can really drive yourself nutty doing that kind of stuff. Also, we assume that we want to improve. But here's where honesty is really hard for us. Do people have any incentives not to improve? Can you imagine incentives that people would have not to improve their lives? Sure. There may be many of them, all right? And the difficult part is for us to see it in ourselves, to recognize, okay, maybe I'm doing that. I would say things like they find some kind of a benefit for being in the position of where they are. It may be because it serves a ready excuse. I say these things with humility because I realize that if people are having severe difficulties, the thing that people say the most to them, more than likely, is where it's all in your head and you're just making excuses. Obviously, that's not what I want to do, but it is a possibility, or the possibility exists, and we have to ask ourselves the right questions. And sometimes we can even get confused and caught up in it, thinking this becomes my identity. Has anyone ever heard of such a thing? I was in reading some materials. This is way back on people with cancer, And one of the things they said many times in the material was, you are not your cancer. You are not your ailment or your difficulty. You are not, that's not who you are. That is what you're experiencing, but it's not you. Why would that be important to recognize? Did Don ever get that kind of statement said to him? Yeah. I knew somebody that, I don't remember what it was that they had, but they were told to name it. So this is just Fred, you know. My friend Fred's back, right? He's mean sometimes, and so we have to kind of put up with him. There are a lot of techniques and tricks, I guess, with that, but I think that's a practice that teaches people to distance yourself from the thing, so we don't get consumed with, this is who I am, this is my identity. And I could imagine that it would be very difficult to be that way if cancer is part of your life. It's really hard, I can imagine, to separate yourself from that, because that's all you live with, right? Or chronic pain or chronic whatever. I know that could be very difficult. And so I've dealt with this with my daughter's told me some things like this. It's kind of hinted at with me that she has to kind of recognize that she is not that. And not to live outside of reality, but to actually not just think that this is inevitable, I can't really do anything about it. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a big part of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes complete sense. I never heard of that one, but that's an interesting one. There's also one of these things where they teach you to think about yourself in the third person. So you're an observer, and you're just seeing, okay, this is a guy who's going through this. And those kinds of things, you want to be careful. I think you don't want to do that too much, but I think the identity is what's important. And it's easy for us as Christians to think about where our identity lies. Our identity lies not in the things that we're suffering, but in Jesus, who helps us to overcome those things, right? And that means different things to different people, obviously, but sooner or later, we're going to be outside of this body. Our bodies are going to be changed, and we're going to be in eternal glory, and that's not going to be there anymore. That problem, whatever it is, it's not going to be there. So that's not who we are. We are beyond that and above it. I think it's important. So being honest, and sometimes people, though, they find identity, they find meaning in their problems and depression. They find sometimes it's just, I really hate saying these kinds of things because it sounds terrible, but sometimes it seems like people have financial benefit better than if they had a job where they couldn't really function well, so they just decide not to fight it. I'm not saying that if people are they're debilitated and they can't work, that it's always the case. I'm not saying that they're faking it. That's not what I mean at all. But we have to ask the question. If we're asking ourselves questions, one of them should be, is this really as bad as I say it is? Because it's easy for us to overblow things. And I speak from experience on that. But having said that, we also need to be fair to ourselves and not go either extreme. All right, so being honest with ourselves. Number 7 is to remember that our feelings are not representations of reality. It's rare that your feelings are actually completely represent reality. They're emotions. And I used to think that when I was a teenager, I used to think, when I got older, my emotions won't be like this. But it may not. The width between the ups and downs may be a little further apart, but they're still up and down, right? And I don't know. I guess that's pretty normal. But I have better coping skills now. I know how to deal with it, but it's just up and down. And so we have to recognize that. It's rare. But we almost always assume that when we feel something, it's real, that means something. And it doesn't actually mean anything. When I was in school at Brown Trail, the director had to fly out one day, and we were all kind of confused, like, what's going on? He had to go. He flew to Florida. I mean, like sudden. And turns out that there was a man who had just graduated a few years before who was down there, and he was running off with one of the elders' wives. And so the director was talking to him. He said, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? He said, God wants me to be happy. And, this is an emotional thing that he had, and so therefore it was real. And so he had to run for it. And we all know we all know better than that, but have we ever gotten caught up in our emotions? Sometimes. Maybe not for that, but, I mean, We've definitely got caught up in our emotions at times. Let's look in Proverbs chapter 17. You really can't function that way, and we all know that, but it can get pretty difficult sometimes, especially when there are a lot of different emotions that are going on. It's hard to know what is actually happening sometimes. It's difficult. I can recognize that. Where I've been through periods of time where I had so many, it was like an ocean of just bubbling different things coming up and extremes, and that's just very disconcerting. Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 20 says, "He who has a deceitful heart finds no good." And let's see here, am I in the right place? Make sure, 17:20. "And he who has a perverse tongue falls into evil." Crooked heart finds no good. He who has a perverse tongue falls into evil. Okay. The deceitful heart is what I was looking at. So if we are deceiving ourselves, if we have a deceitful heart, which we tend to do, we tend to be fooled by it. So in my way of thinking, if you're following your heart, you're not going to find good. Because how do you know if it's deceiving you or not? You don't. If it's an emotion especially, you don't know if it's deceptive or not. If you have a perverse tongue, you're going to fall into evil. So the things that you say and the things that you feel can be very deceptive. Another one is Jeremiah chapter 17. This is probably one of the most common ones, verses to people to turn to. Use this all the time in Bible studies. Verses 7 through 10. And usually it's verse 9 that we quote. "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" But I want you to look at the context here. "Blessed is the man," in verse 7, "who trusts in the Lord and whose hope is in the Lord. For he shall be like a tree planted by the waters, which spreads out its roots by the river, and will not fear when heat comes. But its leaf will be green, and will not be anxious in the year of drought, nor will cease from yielding fruit. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings." All right, so this is not about, in here, this is not about depression, obviously. This is actually in the heading at the very beginning of this chapter is Judah's sin and punishment. But notice what he's saying here about the heart, and he's talking about trusting in the Lord. A lot of the things we've talked about already has been about trusting in God, trusting in the process, and this is where the emotions have to be reined in, that we trust God that things are going to work in accordance with His plan. You know, the thing I've noticed about emotions is they always go away. They always change. It may take a while, but they always change. And we have to trust in God, who will never change. And so when we're putting our faith and our trust in Him, we're not trusting in the things that we think or things that we feel. We're trusting in what He tells us is truth. And if you have been actively involved in Christianity, which all of us have, we all understand what that means. To some degree, we have to trust that God knows what He's talking about. And even though when it may not feel like it may not seem like it, we do know that God always knows what is best, and we can get through whatever it is that we're facing. So I love verse 10. He says, in verse 9, you can't trust your heart, but God knows your heart, and He's testing it. And He also brings out here then, we're going to get the things that we do. It's not related to how we feel, it's related to what we do, right? Our actions are what's really important. So if whatever it is our emotions are telling us, this is what you must do, if we have a hot temper, we are going to be much better off if we don't listen to that emotion and we trust God and do it His way. Then He can help us through it, and it'll make everything better. It may still be difficult, but it's going to be better. All right. Yes. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's what the world teaches. It's look inside. What makes you happy on the inside is what's going to be the right move for you, right? But that's true. Temporarily, and that's the point. So drugs can make someone happy temporarily. Sin makes people happy temporarily. That's why we can't trust how we feel. We have to go by what we know. This comes up a lot too when people are. I've talked to a lot of Christians who doubt their salvation. They say, "I just don't feel like I'm saved." Like, does that really matter? I mean, it matters, but does it? Because your heart can be wrong, and we're going to talk about that too in a little bit. There are plenty of people that I know who believe they're saved when they're not. Is it possible that we can be saved and not feel like we are? Sure. It's just an emotion. How do you know whether or not you're saved? It's not how you feel. It's based on what you know and how you act, how you behave. And so when you look at, for example, in 1 John, that whole book is giving us ways to test ourselves to know whether or not we're right with God. He never one time says, well, I guess you could interpret it this way, but he doesn't have one of the tests as, do you feel like you're saved or not? That's not the test. The test is, do you love God, and how do you know if you love God? Anyone know how to answer that? Because you do what He tells you to do. In fact, He says, the way you know whether you actually love God or not is whether you love your neighbor or yourself. If you can't demonstrate that you love other people, you don't love God. Doesn't matter what you think. You don't love God if you don't love other people, because that's the ultimate test, really, is how we treat one another. Anyway, so the emotion has nothing to do with it. Now, what happens is typically if we get an emotion, it emotes, right? It causes us to act. But what happens if you have an emotion that's wanting you to do something different, contrary to what you know to be true? First, we know that it doesn't control us. We just have to wait it out. How do you change an emotion? Do you know? The absolute best way to change an emotion is action. Your emotions will always follow your actions. Now, it may take a while. There's going to be a lag. But if one of the best pieces of advice I heard when I first got married was, if you don't feel like telling your wife you love her, you tell your wife you love her anyway. Because saying it will help produce the feelings. If you don't feel like going out on a date, you go out on a date anyway. You don't feel like doing what is right, you do it anyway, because actions lead to emotions. Now, if you always this is where a lot of people have problems because they think, well, I don't feel like, I ran into a woman and said, I just don't love my husband anymore. Like, why did you choose not to love him anymore? It's not a choice. Yes, it is. Because you have to make the decision to act in a way that will produce love. That's the only way to do it. Now, what happens is people feel an emotion and they get this whirlwind thing going, and all of a sudden now they think, oh, this is real. It may not be real. It may be based on a lie. It could be real. The only way you're going to know it is to see if you're going to make the commitment over time. And that's the way our bodies are too. Our emotions are that way with our own selves too. So we can commit to fighting against depression, for example, and the only way you can do that really to change your emotion is to do something, to act in a certain way, to do something to shock that and to get it to change. And it gradually changes, but it takes a lot of effort. Also, our emotions are trained by instinct. I don't know about y'all, but for me, a lot of the things I used to do when I was young. Did y'all ever do this? You act because you think you just kind of react to things. You don't really think about how you react to things. It just happens. I remember when I was, 12 years old, I think, my brother pulled my leg and I was in a tree and it scared me and it hurt. And so I jumped down out of the tree and picked up a Coke bottle and threw it at him. I didn't think that went through. But that's how we do things, right? So we tend to react. And what would have happened if I would have gotten away with that and it just solved all of my problems and he came back and he said he was sorry and he never did that kind of thing again? What would be my reaction next time someone pulled my leg in a tree? The same reaction, because it worked, right? So we find things that work, at least temporarily, and we use them over and over and over. And as adults, we have to figure out, that might work, but it really isn't the best way to do it, and then we change. And so we have to train ourselves, and usually by the time we figure out that the way that we're doing it is wrong, it's already an ingrained habit, right? So we have to be careful what we're doing. And our brains, it's possible that we react to stimuli and depression and whatever it is, that cloud. We react to it in certain ways because it worked for a little while, and it may not be the best way to handle it. It may be that we need to change our approach and start doing things a little differently. And we can control and train our feelings even in spite of the fact that there's going to be the ups and downs. There was a statement by a man named Robin Sharma, and I don't remember what he wrote a book. I'd heard this, and I'd looked him up online to see who he was, who said it. He said, "The mind is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master." I would say that about emotions, wouldn't you? Great servant, terrible master. And we've all run into people who are just led around by their emotions. It's not pretty. All right, so any comments about that? Remember, feelings are not representations of reality. Next one would be accept the fact that this might be a lifetime assignment. Look in 1 John chapter 5. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So, it kind of brings up an idea, a thought too, that our emotions, are they good? Are they positive? Are they things that are helpful for us? Not always, but they can be, right? So if we're smart in how we use our emotions, they become a tool. Because if you can create an emotion, which you can, for example, as I was talking about, love, and I'm talking about an emotion, not just the decision. Is that a useful thing in a marriage? Oh yeah, it's very helpful. Or in a friendship, or in lots of situations. So we can create emotions, and they can be very useful for us, or they can also be very detrimental to us. So we have to be very careful, and that goes back to what you're saying too about we need to follow God and see where He's leading us and see what should be developed, and we shouldn't trust our emotions, but we can use them as a tool. So it's a hammer hitting a nail. That's how you use a tool, not to run your life with. I had a friend who was Italian, and he used that as an excuse. It's, of course, stereotype, right? But he embraced the stereotype, and he said, I just can't help myself. I'm a very emotional person. It's just who I am. Like, you're a human being made in the image of God. You can control your emotions. And sometimes we don't do a good job of that, but if we follow man, follow our hearts, we got to follow God. Right. It's a season. And it's useful for its purpose, right? But if it becomes overwhelming or too much, then it's something we have to fight against. That's true. Right. Yeah, and the good thing is we can develop those. It's nurtured. It's like growing a garden. It takes effort, but it can be nurtured and grown. And then it's great when it happens. Have some fruit. All right, the last one was accept that this might be a lifetime assignment. I want to look at 1 John chapter 5 and verse 4. Whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. I'm looking at the footnote here because I didn't notice before. Oh, your faith. So when we are looking at the fact that we have overcome the world, that doesn't mean that we see it immediately, right? Think about when Paul talked about the fact that Jesus has overcome death, but we don't see it yet, right? Actually, it wasn't Paul, it was the Hebrew writer, if I remember right. It's either 1 Corinthians 15 or Hebrews chapter 2, one of those two places. And he's talking about the fact that we don't see it yet, but we do see Jesus, who was for a little while made lower than the angels and has overcome and have been given victory. And we don't see yet, but at one point in time, that will be the occurrence when all enemies are put under his feet. And that's the way it works sometimes in life. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 4, we overcome the world and we have victory. What is the victory that has overcome the world? Our faith. So what does he mean by that? I think it's got to be related to the things we believe and act on. That's what faith is. God is the one, Jesus is the one who has overcome, right? But it's our faith in him that is going to overcome. And we are now overcomers, and we have, if we've been born of God, we have overcome the world. Whatever is born of God overcomes the world. I need to look that up and see if it's present tense. I think it is. The idea is we're overcoming. And it's a process, but it is one that we choose to enact. That's where he says that it's done in faith. This is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. And so it's our belief, our activities, our decisions to see where God is telling us to walk and to walk down that road. Those are the decisions that we make in order for us to overcome. It's not the fact that once we're baptized, we've just overcome everything. In a sense, we have overcome everything because now we are born children of God. But in another sense, we haven't yet overcome yet because we're in the process of overcoming. And it may look instantaneous from the outside, from an eternal perspective, but this is a process that we're going through. And this is going to be for the rest of our lives. We will never be in a place that, and some of you people who are older than me can correct me if I'm wrong, we'll never be in a place where we're not going to have some struggle of some kind, right? We'll have periods of time where it'll be lessened. Sometimes we might even feel like, hey, I'm free, I don't have anything going on. And then we kick ourselves because we know that just right around the corner, something else is waiting for us, right? That's the way life works. And it may be that if you're dealing with this, it may be the rest of your life that you're dealing with it. Just be in it for the long haul. Because ultimately, we have something much better waiting for us, right? And if you... I've thought this many times. It's easy to say it, but it's still a good idea. If you had a guarantee that in order for you to be saved, you had to climb to the top of a mountain on your knees, would you do it? Absolutely, without a doubt. I think that if God would have asked us to do the most astronomical things, that's just part of our nature. We're going to do it. It is interesting that he asked us to get dunked in water, and people refuse to do that, but they would climb Kilimanjaro on their knees if they had to. That's human nature. But it would be worth it, and we know that it would be worth it. But sometimes it's the small things that we're like, man, I don't know if this is worth it, because it just beats on us, and it weighs us down day after day after day. I had a friend who was a preacher. He loved to say this: it's not 6 hours on a cross. No matter what I go through today, it's not 6 hours on a cross. Over time, yeah, it can be really debilitating and really hurt, painful, but it's not 6 hours on a cross. And even if it were, we have something better waiting for us, and it's worth it. So we need to make sure we recognize that. And so anyway, any thoughts on that last one? This might be a lifetime assignment. I hope it's not for anybody, but you just never know. All right, so here are some causes, and I'm just going to read through these really quick. These are possible causes. These are things that I've seen. There may be other things that would add to this if you want to add to it. Anxiety and stress, I think those two are probably, I guess they're the same thing, basically. More than likely, one of the biggest reasons that we're facing problems in this society is this: the inability to deal with that. Chronic illness or pain, that's definitely a big one. Burnout or discouragement, that has been a big one for a lot of people. I've kind of felt like I've written a book on how to get through burnout. Traumatic emotional experiences, somebody is assaulted, that can cause a lot of recurring problems. Recurring sin, this would be addiction also fits in there, but not just addiction. Sin that I guess it would be in a sense addictive, but we're just caught up in doing things. Pornography would definitely fit into that category. Vanity of life or lack of purpose is a huge one. Brain injury is a big one. Genetics is a big one. There's not much you can do about that one. Habitual extreme boredom, that perfectly fits a lot of society today, doesn't it? I think people are bored to tears, and I can prove it just by looking at things that they decide that they're going to fight over. And then extreme selfishness or even narcissism, just selfishness sometimes. It's all about me, and the more you are about you, the more everything has to align with that, make sure everything's good for you, then that means that it's just going to get worse and worse. It's going to compound, and that can definitely be a problem. And then chemical imbalance in the brain, that one's actually being disputed now. There's been some studies that have come out that said it's not the case, but it's still something that we have to deal with. And what I mean by chemical imbalances is that people are at least they used to think, and they're starting to change their mind, that people are born and they have certain serotonin or whatever that either can't be absorbed or is not being produced enough, and so that's where the medication idea comes from. And as I said before, there have been some studies that show that that's not necessarily true. All right, so let me go through this real quick because I didn't realize we're eating up so much time. Here are some of the treatments from my experiences, what I've gone through. Prayer that's focused on two things: thanksgiving, thankfulness, and other people's problems. And you'd be surprised at how dwelling on someone else's problems make yours seem a little bit better. Someone said that if everyone in the community went into a common room and put all of their problems on a table and we all just kind of swapped, all of us would rather go back to our own. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is an interesting idea. So prayer, exercise, at least 30 minutes a day, and even if it's just walking, that has been tremendously helpful. Time with friends. Laughter is the absolute best thing you can do. So there's times when Carl and I were stressed. We're like, well, let's just put on a stupid movie, and we intentionally make ourselves laugh because it helps. It just clears so many things up. There are physiological responses that are very positive. It increases a lot of good things in the body. It even helps with sleep. If you have insomnia, I think you need to go find you a clean comedian and go do a live show somewhere, and that's going to help a lot. That's one of the reasons we enjoy it so much. All right. Any physical activity that breaks the norm, so you break out of your habits, just do something spur of the moment. That helps. What's your diet? So we're talking about eat nutritious foods, don't overeat, don't starve yourself. Also then get enough sleep. Surprisingly, with depression, a lot of people don't get enough sleep when they sleep all the time. It's because they don't sleep well. So you need to find ways to make yourself sleepy so that you can actually get 8 hours of sleep. And that might be taking melatonin or whatever it is you can do. And get the right 8 hours of sleep. That would mean going to bed at a decent time in the day, in the evening, not waiting till 2 in the morning to go to sleep and getting 8 hours, because that actually throws your brain off. Sunlight or a sunlight lamp. Essential oils, I got a whole list of them that I use. Drink more water, consume minerals, write out your thoughts and ideas. I've got notebooks written of just writings, and set new plans and goals to reinforce the old ones. And I would read 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 through 11. That's what we're going to end with, but we don't have time. So any other comments? Thank y'all very much for putting up with me going through this, and we're going to shift gears next week.